My name is Satoru Kanzaki. I'm 45 now. I inherited my father's blood, and I run a small art gallery in this corner of Tokyo. I display my own landscape paintings, not the ones my father left behind. Let me talk about my father, Ryuma Kanzaki. There was a time when he was called the Caravaggio of manga, light and shadow, life and death. The Gekiga, graphic drama he drew, always danced on that boundary line, especially in the 80s, as the fever of the bubble economy engulfed Japan. My father's pen was at its sharpest. However, his life itself was far more violent, a story of darkness where the light never reached, more so than any of his works. When I was a child, my father was already known as a troublemaker. He was a man who grew up in the post-war slums, Yamaichi, of Osaka in the 1950s, a city still bearing the scars of the war. His childhood was chaos, a mix of hunger, violence, and the remnants of American culture. Satoru, being an artist is a business where you vomit out the hell you've seen onto the paper, my father often said. His early works, like Blood on the Asphalt and City Without Sun, vividly depicted the pitch-black reality he experienced as a youth. There were no pretty words like ninkyo, chivalry, or giri ninjo, duty and humanity, in them. There was only the bare struggle for survival and betrayal. My father made his name at the end of the 70s, riding the wave of the Gekiga boom. His brushwork became all the rage. But along with the fame, the tinderbox he carried also began to ignite. My father always carried a blade. Even during meetings with editors or assistants, he would clutch the Italian switchblade hidden inside his leather jacket. He had several run-ins with the police, unauthorized weapon possession, assault. His short temper was always the trigger for the incidents. There's a famous story. One night, while he was drinking in a bar in Shinjuku Golden Gai, a rising young manga artist publicly criticized his work, calling it a banal repetition of cheap violence. My father silently put down his glass and smashed an ashtray into the man's face. The man suffered serious injuries that took 3 months to heal. My father was arrested on the spot, but with the publishing company's power and a bribe to the Underworld, he was quickly released. Still, that incident made his aberrant brutality known to the public. I, Satoru, kill people with what I draw. That's why I need to see real blood, or my pen dulls. His studio was always filled with cigarette smoke, the smell of ink, and a strange tension. He deliberately blurred the boundary between his fictional world and the real world. It was as if he yearned to become the villain in his own story. And that ambiguity led to the tragedy of May 28, 1986. The other party was a man named Ban, known at the time as the go-between for the manga industry and the underworld. Ban was ostensibly the president of a small publishing company, but in reality he was a loan shark connected to a Sumiyoshi Kai affiliate and a fervent patron of my father. Without his financial support, many of my father's experimental Gekiga works would never have seen the light of day. At the same time, he was my father's debt. My father was a gambling addict. Mahjong, bicycle races, stocks. He would instantly melt away the vast sums he earned from drawing. He relied on Ban to cover those holes. During the peak of the bubble economy, money flowed through the city like a flood, but it never stayed in my father's hands. I was an elementary school student at the time, but I witnessed the tense exchanges over borrowing and lending money many times in the corner of my father's studio. Thick wads of cash flying, low-voiced, menacing conversations, and the inexplicable irritation in my father's eyes. It wasn't just the pain of debt. It was an issue of status. My father felt that Ban looked down on him as an artist who could be controlled by money. The theme of my father's Gekiga was always anti-authority and freedom, but the reality was servitude, bowing his head to a patron of the underworld. That contradiction was eating away at my father's soul. May 28, 1986, behind a pachinko parlor on the outskirts of Kabukicho, Shinjuku. I heard that my father and Ban escalated a verbal argument over a pachinko betting dispute into a fierce fight. There are various theories about the cause. One is cheating in the betting. Ban had connections to the pachinko parlor, and my father supposedly flew into a rage, believing Ban had deceived him. Another is a woman. A love triangle involving a hostess named Mayumi, who was my father's model. My father loved Mayumi, but she was tied to Ban's establishment, and my father couldn't bear the thought that the woman he loved was also something bought with money. In any case, it was a brutal struggle for honor and dominance between men of the Showa era. My father extended the blade of his beloved manga utility knife and slashed at Ban. It wasn't a standard cutter. It was a blade made of special steel used for detailed gekiga corrections, an extremely sharp edge. My father later testified to the police that he didn't intend to kill him. He just wanted to shame him. According to his testimony, the target was Ban's hand. To prevent him from ever pointing a finger and insulting someone again. However, the blade plunged deeply into Ban's abdomen. Ban collapsed onto the asphalt. The blood, illuminated by the neon lights of Kabukicho, bled out like black ink, as a Yakuza member who later saw the scene described. My father came back to his senses on the spot, threw the cutter away, and stood frozen. Around him, a few pachinko customers and Ban's subordinates. That day, my life was concluded, just like a manga I drew. My father ran. The palm of the hand that had grasped the cutter was stained bright red with Ban's blood. That blood had a far heavier color than the vermilion ink used in my father's graphic novels. My father's escape was exactly like the final chapter of the violent manga he used to draw. Leaving Tokyo, the first place he hid was Osaka, the city where he grew up, still deeply shadowed by the post-war darkness. He relied on an old friend. That friend was now an executive in a secondary Yamaguchi Gumi affiliate. The man, called Ken, had been my father's close companion since their time in the juvenile reformatory. Ken sheltered my father and prepared him a new passport and an alias. Ryuma, what you did wasn't just a fight. Ban was Sumiyoshi Kai. This is going to escalate into an issue of gang honor. Get out of the country fast, Ken warned him. The Yakuza society of the time was one where gang wars were commonplace. One death could quickly lead to organizational retaliation. My father, behind his fame as a manga artist, had unknowingly plunged into the vortex of a giant chivalry logic. My father started a hermit life in an old tenement house in Osaka. In the sunless room, he continued to draw relentlessly. Most of the works drawn during his escape are unfinished, but the strength of his lines had increased manifold, especially the depiction of the eyes. I know no other work that portrays human fear, regret, and the shadow of death so viscerally. It was as if he was trying to defy fate by drawing the end he would soon face. In that room, my father drew self-portraits repeatedly. His own figure, holding the knife, sweating coldly, staring at the canvas. In those self-portraits, the flame of rebellion that his gekiga protagonists possessed was gone, replaced by the eyes of a mere cowering beast. However, my father's short temper consumed him just as much as his talent. 6 months later, while walking the streets of Osaka, my father got into an argument with local street thugs over a trivial matter. Despite being a fugitive, my father knocked out the thug, leaving him critically injured. This incident led to his location being exposed to the police and, crucially, Ban's gang. I just couldn't separate myself from blood. The smell of ink and the smell of blood. I couldn't breathe without both. My father later confessed that. He couldn't escape the real-life violence of the world he drew. His life had been completely dominated by his own graphic novel. Ken was furious. Ryuma, you've ruined our face. I can't hide you anymore. Friendship crumbled easily before the logic of the organization. Ken arranged a boat for my father and ordered him to go to Europe via Taiwan. As a final severance payment, He handed my father a pistol. With the gun in his hand, my father left the dark port of Osaka for the next stage of his fugitive life. It was as if he were living the climax of the manga he had written. The next place my father reached was Malta. Why Malta? Throughout his escape, my father was always conscious of the painter Caravaggio, a man who, also a murderer, was chased out of Rome and sought restoration of honor by joining the Knights of Malta. Perhaps my father believed he could break free from the gekiga he had drawn while in Malta. Malta was an island filled with sun and the silence of stone structures, completely different from the clamor of Tokyo or Osaka. My father, under the alias Ryu Tanaka, began assisting with the restoration of frescoes in a small church there. He held natural pigments instead of ink, trying to flee the world of blood and violence into sacred tranquility. I have a postcard my father sent me during that period. It showed the blue sea of Malta and, in his handwriting, only one sentence. Satoru, the light is burning me alive. My father was a man who had always depicted darkness. The characters in his gekiga were always struggling in the shadows, searching for a tiny light. But the fierce Maltese sun, the unearned light, must have been unbearable for him. The light was an interrogator, illuminating the sins of his past even more vividly. However, my father's karma pursued him even across the sea. About a year and a half into his life in Malta, my father caused another violent incident during a drinking session with local fishermen. The cause was a trivial insult. One of the fishermen uttered a derogatory comment about my father being Japanese. My father was no longer a manga artist or an acquaintance of the Yakuza, he was just a fugitive. Nevertheless, his short temper and obsession with honor drove him. My father struck the fisherman's head with a liquor bottle, inflicting injuries that required 6 weeks to recover. The Maltese police arrested my father for assault, and his fingerprints were cross-referenced with the Japanese National Police Agency database, revealing his true identity as Ryuma Kanzaki to the entire world. Tokyo murder suspect arrested in Malta. The news swept across Japan. His gekiga fans were both thrilled by his real-life violence and simultaneously disappointed. Was their idol merely a savage criminal? After the arrest, my father was sent to an old Maltese prison. It is even said that the jail was the same place where Caravaggio was once incarcerated. What must my father have thought, staring at those cold stone walls? He must have realized that his life was accurately tracing the tragic fate of a painter who lived 4 centuries earlier. I tried to escape by drawing, but violence was my true nature. My father's words echo in my heart like the cry of despair of a person who tore out the last page of their own self-written manga. The extradition of my father from Malta to Japan took over 2 years due to the complexity of the international extradition treaties at the time. During this period, my father was transferred to a prison in Naples, Italy. Naples. It was the first city Caravaggio fled to after the murder in Rome, and the birthplace of some of his masterpieces. My father was in the middle of a cynical repetition of history. In the Naples prison, my father began to write letters. To me, to my mother, and his confession. My father's handwriting was usually strong and rough, but the script in these letters was shaking and small. To Satoru, I have lost all honor as your father. Men who chose the way of the Ninkyo at least shed blood for duty, but the blood I shed was merely the blood of emotion, the blood of a coward. In that letter, my father revealed the truth behind Ban's murder for the first time. Ban treated Mayumi as a tool, as a prop for the manga I drew. I knew that, but I owed him money, so I couldn't say anything. That day, during the argument over the gambling cheat, Ban laughed and said, "The women you draw can only survive with my money." That statement tore at my father's soul as an artist. My father felt that his image of the free woman, the strong woman he drew, had been completely mocked by the real-life chains of money. That's why my father aimed the cutter at Ban's hand, specifically the hand that grasped money. He wanted to cut off the arrogance of a man who controlled everything with money, but the result was death. In my rage, I became the murderer I drew. I covered my reality with the logic of my graphic novel. I regret it. I regret making you the son of a killer. The 2 years of imprisonment in Naples thoroughly cleansed my father's soul. He held neither ink nor pen. He simply faced his sin relentlessly. He must have realized how much the world of violence he created was a fiction, and how shallow it was compared to reality. Violence is not an answer. It is merely a chain reaction. The Vesuvius volcano visible from the window of the Naples prison must have been a symbol of anger, and at the same time a symbol of the end for my father. And then, in 1988, as the last frenzy of the bubble enveloped Japan, my father was handed over to the Japanese police. He changed his title from fugitive to defendant. His return caused a sensation in Japan at the time. The heretic of the manga world had returned as a murderer. People were thrilled by his dramatic life, but I saw only one utterly exhausted man. My father's trial became a media show, reflecting the social climate of the time. The prosecution painted my father as a dangerous lunatic of violence who confused the world of Gekiga with reality and demanded the death penalty. The defense claimed artistic mental stress and self-defense, but public opinion was harsh towards my father. In court, my father maintained silence throughout. He only answered with a small voice, saying yes or no to questions. However, during his final statement, he spoke the words of Ryuma Kanzaki, the manga artist, in court for the first time. I tried to escape my violence by drawing graphic novels, but I myself was devoured by what I drew. The act of killing Ban was merely a crime, unrelated to my art, but within me, violence and beauty were always two sides of the same coin. Perhaps my father tried to self-defend by describing his crime as artistic excess, but his words inadvertently revealed how closely the fiction of Gekiga was connected to the darkness of reality. The verdict was 15 years in prison. After the trial, my father showed me a smile when I visited him. It was the first calm smile I had seen since I was a child. Satoru, with this, I can stop being the protagonist of a graphic novel called Ryuma Kanzaki and become Ryu Tanaka, a mere prisoner. I'm free. By acquiring the title of murderer, he was ironically freed from the false image bound by his violent talent, the Caravaggio of manga. My father's life in prison was filled with silence. He completely stopped drawing. Instead, he worked as the prison librarian, endlessly reading books. And in prison, my father began writing poetry instead of letters. His poems were written on Japanese paper using sumi ink and an inkstone. There was none of the intensity of his Gekiga. They were filled with a tranquility like haiku. In one of his poems, there is this passage, "Blood ink dries, leaving behind the blue sky." He who spent his life drawing darkness was seeking light and tranquility at the end of it. I once asked my father, "Why don't you draw anymore?" Staring at the clouds outside the window, he answered quietly, "All I can draw is hell, and I don't want to show hell to anyone anymore." My father's atonement was not drawing. He sealed his violent talent in the form of silence. However, fate did not grant my father a complete end. My father was paroled after completing his sentence in 1995. It was the year of the Great Hanshin earthquake, a time when Japanese society as a whole, in the exhaustion of the bubble crash, began searching for the next era. The Showa era was completely over, and a new era, Heisei, welcomed my father. He was no longer Ryuma Kanzaki. He lived quietly in a small apartment in the suburbs of Tokyo under the name Ryu Tanaka. I let my father live in the room behind my small gallery. Every morning he was meticulous about cleaning the windows and sweeping, and he would just silently gaze at the landscape paintings that I drew. He never tried to talk about his past. One day, I showed my father his original Gekiga drawings. They were the works I had secretly preserved, considered his masterpieces. My father took the drawings in his hands and smiled quietly. "Satoru, these lines are youth and hunger, but I no longer have that heat inside me. This is the money that raised you, and it is also the proof of my sin." He returned the original drawings to me and never touched them again. My father continued his journey of atonement. That journey was simply continuing to live. He accepted the punishment of a quiet daily life in place of the violence he had created. However, in the spring of 2000, cancer struck my father. On his sickbed, my father made one last request to me. "Satoru, cast my pen into the sea, and that utility knife stained with blood ink too." I followed his words. After my father died, I collected all his belongings and cast them into a quiet place in Tokyo Bay. My father, like Caravaggio, sought forgiveness, was trapped by violence, and then, before receiving forgiveness, his life was ended by illness. He was 65 years old. His life was the Showa era itself. Born in the darkness, sought the light, and was then swallowed by the darkness. His gravestone is not inscribed with Ryuma Kanzaki, but with Ryu Tanaka, and beneath it, one line of the poem my father wrote last is quietly carved. Blood ink dries, leaving behind the blue sky. I am now continuing to draw landscapes atop my father's sin. The light and tranquility that my father could never find.